Welcome to Counter Apologetics. I'm your host, Emerson Green, and today we're talking about the psychology of religion. We're going to talk about some modern research in the cognitive science of religion, which illuminates the likely evolutionary origins of religious belief, specifically hyperactive agency and signaling theories. These theories are antecedently more likely on naturalism than on theism, so while logically consistent with theism, they do provide good evidence against theism and for naturalism. That's roughly what we'll be talking about today. But before we get there, let me introduce our guest, the co-host of the prolific YouTube channel, Naturalism Next. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So would you mind telling us a little about yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Sebastian. I recently graduated from Amherst College with a degree in psychology, and my main research focuses there were in neuroscience, psychology, and specifically evolutionary psychology and cognitive science, and then also philosophy of religion. So sort of the perfect background really to get into stuff related to the psychology of religion and its implications for theism. In terms of where people can find what I do, yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I have a blog. It's called Naturalism Next. I don't publish very often there, but I'm hoping to change that in the near future. So, but I've been active in philosophy of religion spaces for a while, so that's how I know Emerson and other people in the community.
Right. I very much enjoyed your video that you have up there.
My singular video, yeah.
Yeah. So before we get into the argument, can you tell us a little why you're interested in psychology of religion?
Yeah, I think the main reason I got interested in that is from a young age, I have always been sort of irreligious naturally, which I think is unusual, actually. I think most people sort of describe growing up believing in some sort of God or supernatural entity and then sort of coming away from it after reading more or after having qualms with their particular tradition. But I was sort of always the opposite. I always sort of didn't feel like I detected any sort of supernatural agency, and I sort of always found the stories to be a little bit silly, to say it in a slightly non-polite way. But I think that because of that, I was fascinated by the fact that people did sort of very strongly believe in these things, and I always wanted to understand why, because to me it just came so unnaturally, and so I didn't understand why there's so much widespread belief in God or supernatural agency. And so that's why I started studying the psychology of religion, really. And I think it actually did really help me answer those questions. And I sort of realized that I'm actually the bizarre case more than everyone else is. That in fact we are sort of naturally inclined to believe, and I just happen to be born without that inclination, it seems.
Yeah, your sensus divinitatis has been damaged by sins. I won't speculate as to which ones, but yeah, that's probably what's going on here. So what we're talking about today, like the argument kind of starts with the fact that we can understand the existence and prevalence of religious belief through the framework of evolutionary theory and cognitive science of religion. So we've got like a natural mechanism that can account for religious belief and practice, so how it forms and then like how it spreads. And that's obviously, important if we're naturalists and, we need an explanation of the prevalence and persistence of religious beliefs beyond just like personal curiosity, like satisfying why people believe in God if there isn't a God. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating in its own right. But even if you have no interest in philosophy of religion or apologetics, you might still wonder about, the distinctively human beliefs and practices that constitute religion. But as you argue, it actually is evidence for naturalism and against theism that there are these like plausible evolutionary origins of religion. Even though it's consistent with theism, it's still strong evidence favoring naturalism.
Right. And I think that's one mistake some people will make when they hear this research is they'll hear, so we have a natural account of religion that doesn't require invoking supernatural agency. It doesn't that in and of itself constitute evidence against theism. And I think quite rightly, a lot of Christian scientists or theist philosophers have pointed out that that's not the case, right? Because God can work through natural means. There's no inconsistency in God using evolution or using our cognitive predispositions precisely in order to generate religious belief and religious adherence. So there's no contradiction, as far as I can tell, unless you find some religion that explicitly posits that, hey, the way religion comes about is not via natural means, it's via perhaps some direct sort of supernatural implanting of belief in people. If you could find that, there'd be a contradiction, but that's going to be quite hard to find.
Is that getting closer to like what Plantinga thinks with the sensus divinitatis? Like, is that closer to what you're describing there?
I'm not actually sure what Plantinga would say about the cognitive science of religion. I'm trying to remember if I feel like I read something that he wrote related to it, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I like Plantinga, but I haven't read any of his books. I've just read like a couple of papers and listened to him speak, but I'm sure he's written about this. But yeah, I'm just unfamiliar with his views to know if he would actually have a problem with anything that we're going to be talking about. I actually don't know, but yeah, I
He
mean,
might actually want to take it as evidence for the sensus divinitatis and say, hey, look, it actually turns out to be the case that we are predisposed towards belief in God and perhaps even in theism in particular. Although I'd probably dispute that second point, though some scientists argue for it.
yeah,
And
like
you might
our properly functioning cognitive faculties under normal conditions produce belief in God, and that's
exactly,
evidence. Yeah,
and you might even say that's evidence for theism. And in fact, I'd sort of be inclined to agree with that. But the problem is when you get into the specifics of the data start to really heavily tilt away from theism. But if you just have the general fact that we're all predisposed towards belief in God, that seems like it could be some kind of evidence for theism prior to looking
yeah.
at the specifics of how that's come about.
Right. I mean, I was going to save this more for the end, but yeah, it does seem like if we're all kind of naturally predisposed to believe in God and like that's why belief in God is so prevalent and persistent, then yeah, wouldn't you expect that on theism, like where God wants a relationship with us? Whereas if the situation were reversed and like, it was very unnatural to believe in God, then that would be pretty surprising on a hypothesis that God designed us and wanted a relationship with us. And like, oh, no one believes in him. And it's like really weird and unnatural to believe in him.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, okay, this is a part that other people have probably come across, like with Michael Shermer or Steven Pinker or other people who talk about um, cognitive science of religion in some capacity. This would be like the hyperactive agency detection device that, it's yeah, I mean, it's crazy how popular this has gotten in such a short amount of time. But like, was that term, the hyperactive agency device, was that coined by Justin Barrett?
I think it was coined by Justin Barrett, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
you reference him a lot in your in this section of the paper.
Yeah, and Justin Barrett's a great. He's a scientist. He's also a Christian. So he's done a lot of research on the cognitive science of religion and some writing on why he thinks that it doesn't conflict with theism at all. In fact, there's some good passages. I think he has a book, "Why Would Anyone Believe in God?" I think is what it's called, um, or something along those lines. And in that book, he sort of talks about how a Christian might incorporate the research into their religious belief and might accommodate it into a Christian framework. But yeah, he coined, I believe he coined the idea of a hyperactive agency detection device. And basically all it is, as you said, it's sort of the most popularized research that's come out of the cognitive science of religion. So a lot of people are already probably familiar with it. But it's just the idea that we're really hyper attuned to detect agency in the world, right? If we see an ambiguous stimuli, like we see clouds, or we're in the dark, or we're looking at a strange rock formation, we'll often like see faces or assume that a sound is a result of some agent acting rather than just a coincidence. And the thought is that this is highly evolutionarily advantageous, right? Because if you falsely detect the presence of an agent when it's not there, that's kind of not a huge cost, right? It's a bit of extra energy you've expended maybe. But if you don't think there's agency there and there really is agency there, then you might be in serious trouble because that could put you in serious danger. So constantly being aware of the threat of there being some kind of agent around you seems like it would be quite evolutionarily beneficial. And so that's sort of the underlying notion but behind this device. And I should also note that this is not something that seems unique to human beings, right? You see
Mhm.
animals sort of skitter away and run away from the slightest sound or noise as well. So this isn't going to really get you religious belief on its own, but it's an important prerequisite, it seems.
Yeah, no, I remember Dan Dennett talking about his dog. This was like one of the first times I heard this idea where he was like sitting with his dog by like fireplace or something and some snow fell off the roof and then his dog immediately leapt up and started barking at it and he just used that, as an example of like, look, humans and non-human animals both make this kind of error where they mistakenly think there are agents where there aren't any agents. But yeah, we kind of have this like cognitive framework. I don't know what metaphor is best, but like, we yeah, pick up on all of these patterns and noise and kind of attribute like, yeah, faces and agents. Like we pick up all this stuff that, and like most of the time, or some of the time it's there, some of the time it's not there. But yeah, it's obviously advantageous because if you're being stalked by like a predator or something and you don't realize there's like an agent in your vicinity and like what its intentions are, then you're going to be taken out of the gene pool. Whereas if you just mistakenly see faces on toast all the time, it's not really a big deal. Or like if you like see agents and there aren't any there, who cares? But if you don't see an agent that is there, then yeah, you're you're going to be selected against.
Exactly. Well, so we should add in the sort of the second part to what I sort of call prolific agency cognition in the paper, which is that, so you have the hyperactive agency stuff, and then you sort of want to add on to that sort of our ability to explicitly reason about the intentions and goals of agents, to sort of have this folk psychological explanation of, hey, here are the things that agents think, here's what they desire, here's what they intend, and you have to sort of combine that with our disposition towards detecting agency everywhere. And that's when you can sort of get more explicit belief in agents. Now, you can imagine that if we didn't have that or if we didn't have the first ability, the hyperactive agency detection device, we could still sort of make up agents, but we'd just be way less likely to do so because we wouldn't constantly be sort of picking up signals from the environment that say there are agents everywhere. So you might still be able to sort of create concepts of supernatural or non-empirical agents, but the probability that we would create them would be a lot lower than it would be without that device.
Right. So like you make a distinction in the paper between explicit reflective beliefs about these concepts and like more implicit representations. So like we start with the more implicit, like immediate representations of mind somewhere, and then that kind of transitions into the more reflective religious concepts that are more refined and developed like over time, but it never would have happened initially unless there was this initial like misfiring, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And although I'd be hesitant to call it a misfiring, because that would sort of assume that
Right.
you're not actually detecting them, which is what I probably think, but not what a religious person would want to think necessarily. But yes, that's right, that you sort of start with these implicit beliefs where you haven't spelled out propositionally what you think, but you have an implicit assumption that there's an agent there in some sense. And then as you sort of start to think about these agents and maybe make up stories around them, pass them on down generations, and then sort of formalize them into explicit traditions. And this is sort of where history sort of comes in addition to cognitive science. And we talk about the history of actually like forming these belief systems. That's when you start to get more explicit reflective belief, where people will publicly state, yeah, this is the proposition that I'm adhering to.
Right. And like what you would expect, I mean, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but like what you would expect the history of religion to look like if it was kind of ultimately the product of these psychological mechanisms that you're talking about. The history of religion does kind of track with the development that you would expect if it had these kinds of naturalistic origins that we're talking about now, but we haven't gotten to the signaling theory part yet. But yeah, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but yeah, I mean, I don't want to like beg the question or anything by saying, oh, it's misfiring, like straight out of the gate, but it's not like we have a sentience detector that never misfires. Like we know it misfires in both directions. Like every like theist or atheist should be able to admit that, like, yeah, our agency detection is sometimes like underactive and sometimes hyperactive. Like we do make these mistakes. So it's not like we have this objective like detector of minds and sentience and stuff. Like we absolutely, it should be common ground that we have some kind of psychological module or whatever you want to call it that attributes mind and agency out in the world where there isn't any.
Right, and there's actually the potential here for evolutionary debunking kind of argument against the rationality of theism. That's not where I go at all in the paper, but you might try and make the argument that, hey, this device we have that it seems like underlies a lot of religious belief is quite unreliable. It seems like it fires a lot of times where there is an agency. And if the thing underlying the formation of this belief is unreliable, then perhaps the belief itself is unreliable. I'm not sure what I think about that argument. I think that kind of argument probably doesn't work actually, but there have been people who try and make that kind of argument based on this research.
Interesting. Wait, why don't you think that sort of argument works?
Well, I think it's going to, you're going to sort of need to be a reliabilist, I think is the term, right? You're going to need to think that in order to have a justified belief, it will need to have come about by a process that's reliable in some way, a cognitively reliable process. And so you might just reject that and therefore not have the problem anymore.
Okay, so you'd have to first argue for, not exactly a controversial epistemic thesis, but something that's not like a given. There are like reasonable competitors for it, and you think if you accepted maybe one of the alternatives, then the argument just wouldn't work.
Yeah, and I think the other problem is that religious people are going to say, look, hey, this might be sort of one of the things underlying the belief, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes into it too, right? Even if it's the case that the origins of this belief are partially in this device that's somewhat unreliable. We then come to reflect and reason about the belief and test it against the evidence. And on the basis of that evidence, we come to see that in fact it is rational. And so you might say, yes, sure, there's this sort of sketchy process underlying it, so to speak, but I've reasoned about it and reflected about it in other ways and found that it's rational for these other reasons. And so that might be another way you might want to go around that kind of argument.
Okay. What do you think about Paul Bloom's sort of thing about how we're natural born dualists? Like, have you looked into that research at all, or like, do you have any like agreements or disagreements with the general claim that human beings naturally are kind of born dualists?
Yeah, that's one of the pieces of research I read when I was doing this project, and I don't recall. It's been a couple of years now since I read that research, but I do remember thinking that the studies seemed correct on that. It seems like we are inclined to be natural born dualists. And in philosophy of mind, it's pretty much a given that most people would admit, hey, we have like pretty strong dualist intuitions. A lot of physicalists, what they try and do is explain why we have such dualist intuitions, even though our brains are purely physical. I think that's Papanow's entire project in a way, is to explain why we're so inclined towards being dualists. So I don't have any strong objections to that research off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, there's pre-reflectively like a mind and there's a body, and you just cross out the physical body, and then you have spirits and maybe other spiritual beings, like gods or angels or demons. So yeah, it seems like belief in unembodied minds could come naturally given our like inborn tendency to dualism, because it's just such an easy step to just cross out the physical body, and then you just have the spirit. And then yeah, it seems like that alone is like, you're halfway there with some pretty essential religious concepts.
Yeah, that's another piece of the puzzle that I don't really go over in the paper that I wrote, but is key. And I should know there's a lot of parts of the cognitive science of religion we won't end up talking about that are worth exploring. I sort of focus on the prolific agency stuff and then the signaling stuff, which I'm sure we'll come to soon. But there's a number of other really interesting theories out there that you can sort of go through all of them and say, hey, what does this theory say about theism? What does this theory say about naturalism? And that's sort of a more extended project that I hope someone will undertake at some point. But I sort of picked signaling and hyperactive agency because I think those are the two most empirically supported parts of the cognitive science of religion. They're certainly the most like written about.
Mm-hmm. And I just don't want to give people the opportunity to like strawman this at all, because you're not saying explicitly that like, oh, we have this hyperactive agency detection and that's why people believe in God. They're just like, it gets stimulated or something, and that's theistic belief, like end of story. Like, it's like you said, you make this distinction between the more immediate beliefs and then the like more refined reflective beliefs that develop over time. So I just have a feeling that it would be easy to strawman this argument at some point by just saying like, like honing in on specific religious circumstances and saying like, do you really think there's like some kind of, the same thing that happened with Dennett's dog when the snow fell off the roof? Like, that's what happens in like this church service or something. And it's like, no, not exactly. That's not really what you're saying.
That's right. Yeah. And I want to be very explicit, actually, and be quite careful here and say that I very explicitly think that the hyperactive agency device alone is not enough to generate religious belief. You need the ability to cognize about agents. You need a historical tradition with a variety of contingencies that come about. You also need and we didn't really get into this, but there's research on certain kinds of agents being more likely to be believed in and passed on than others. There's a whole story about like how parents and societies will engage in certain credibility enhancing displays that make certain beliefs more likely to be passed on. So there's a whole set of things going into this, of which the hyperactive agency device is just a single part of. So just that alone, definitely not enough to get explicit belief.
Right. So can we move into signaling theory at this point, or is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we move on?
Oh, let's move on to signaling.
Okay, so signaling theory, as I understand it, just starts off with the pretty obvious observation that, group membership is advantageous, like evolutionarily speaking. And signaling theory is about how these groups are maintained or something like that?
Yeah, so obviously being in a group is a huge evolutionary benefit. It gives you mating opportunities, economic opportunities, social support, security, all sorts of things like that. So you want to be in a group. Now, the problem is that they're free riders. What is a free rider? Well, it's someone who joins a group, but they don't contribute to the group. They take the advantages of being in the group, but they never give to the group at all. And that's a serious detriment to group behavior. And so early human societies, in the absence of really strong governmental structures that can sort of punish free riders, needed to figure out a way to keep free riders out. And what signaling is, it's a hypothesized sort of mechanism to sort of solve this free rider problem. And the idea is that if in order to join a group, you have to display some signal of your loyalty to the group in some way, especially a signal that's really costly to yourself or really hard to fake, then you're going to display that you're a genuine member who's committed to that group. It's going to be a lot more costly for someone who doesn't really believe in the group to engage in these displays of signaling than someone who does actually buy into the group's tenets. And so signaling behavior is meant to be this way to weed out potential free riders who might join groups. So that's not even talking about religion yet, but that's just generally what signaling behavior is meant to be.
Right. So, you have these religious communities that are tied together by genuine commitment to doctrines, and I don't know if the doctrines themselves involve like costly signaling because some of them are kind of weird, but they at least like distinguish the group from other groups. But, there are also these rituals, and there are just like many, costly signals as a way to weed out cheaters and to like maintain cooperation, kind of organically. So, like as you mentioned, there are all these evolutionary advantages. It's obviously, adaptive to be a part of these groups, but yeah, like there's this major problem where people could like take the advantages of being in the group and then not really give anything back. Yeah, so then there's this costly signaling that arises. But I would imagine this is like the same kind of process is involved, right? Like you were describing earlier, how there's kind of the like raw material that's provided just by, ordinary evolutionary mechanisms. And then there's this development, over time. So I'm guessing circumcision didn't just like, that wasn't just like directly evolved. Like, I don't know. So what is the process in your mind that like, how do you get from like, okay, I can understand like the idea of costly signaling, but how do you get some of the like specific costly signals that we know and love, like sacrificing your best crops or your best animals or cutting off a part of your genitalia? Like, how does this stuff get started exactly?
That's a good question. I think for a lot of it, when you get into really, really specific signals, there's not going to be a evolutionary story we can tell about why that specific signal is the one that got developed. It will just be a matter of contingency. But I would say that there's a consistent pattern across all these signals, and it's really interesting if you look at the sort of early primitive hunter-gatherer rituals around religion that you have to do to get into the group. They're always really extreme. Like they involve really, really strenuous tasks, going off into the desert or the forest for days and not eating and just doing all these horrible things. So they always tend to be quite costly for someone who wouldn't actually believe truly that what they're doing is valuable or committing in some way. And so that's sort of the way you can tie it back into evolution. But a term that I haven't used yet, I probably should now use, is sort of the idea that religion's more of a byproduct of evolution. So we have this predisposition towards signaling behavior, and religion is just a particularly good way to help promote that signaling behavior. So it's sort of a byproduct of our evolutionary predispositions. But in terms of why specific traditions sort of come up with the signals and traditions that they do, I think that's going to end up being just contingent, probably. You don't want to get into the trap of trying to explain every single mechanism via evolution, right? Every single like specific little detail of a ritual by evolutionary mechanisms. That's probably going to be a bad idea.
So like when people talk about these evolved capacities or like, religion as a product of evolution, there is this like debate over whether religion was a byproduct or an adaptation. And yeah, like to me, it's the signaling theory stuff makes it sound like, well, look, these groups are advantageous. So some of these groups are just religious in character, and that they evolve, like they're adaptations. Religion is adaptive, but the hyperactive agency detection stuff makes it sound more like it was at least initially a byproduct. So obviously this could change over time. Like something could start off as a byproduct of an adaptation and then be sort of co-opted, in this like exaptive process. So it's not like an all or nothing thing here, but Yeah, like where do you come down generally in this? Like, is religion an adaptation, or is it a byproduct, or is it some of both?
I tend to favor the byproduct approach, mainly because it seems to me that things like signaling and hyperactive agency detection are things that have sort of been deeply ingrained for hundreds of thousands of years within humans and way before humans existed. So there was a lot more time for them to sort of stick around and become adaptive. While religion is a much more recent phenomenon in human history, and it seems to me that religion just happens to be particularly good at sort of co-opting these mechanisms and sort of leeching off of them. But I think to argue that religion is adaptive is harder. This is going to get us into questions we might not want to talk about in this podcast, but there's going to be questions about sort of the unit of selection. So there's a question of whether selection operates at the level of like genes, individuals, or groups. And I think it's really hard to argue that, hey, there's like specific religious genes that are adaptive, or at least I haven't seen the evidence for that. So you'd probably want to start going to something like group selection. But then I think group selection is really problematic and basically false. I don't think it's a viable explanation. Maybe a different podcast would be good to talk about that, because that gets us down a whole rabbit hole. But that gives you a general picture of what my position is on that.
Okay, yeah, the levels of selection debate is pretty fascinating. But so you think that the question of whether religious belief and practice is an adaptation or a byproduct, at least partially, turns on the levels of selection debate?
It might. It depends on whether you're going to be able to tie in religion to sort of being specifically inheritable as like a genetic thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that does seem implausible.
Because you could sort of say, hey, look, groups that are religious are more successful than groups that aren't religious. That seems like an easier thing to say than like, hey, there's specific genes for religiosity. Now there might be. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised maybe people have found something, but it's just harder to establish than to use selection.
Well, I mean, I was thinking of genes for like specific religious beliefs, like, like you said, without falling into the trap of thinking that these like highly specific and probably contingent practices or beliefs are like adaptive or whatever. Still, some of like the general features that are shared by religions, like I don't know, at least more plausible that some of the very, very general features that seem common to a lot of religions that might have some kind of genetic basis. But actually, last time we were talking, I think I brought up these like twin studies, like the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, and some of this just data of like identical twins that are separated at birth. They don't know the other one exists, and then these psych researchers kind of like study both of them, and then there's just so much interesting stuff that comes out of that. But one of the things was that your level of religiosity does seem to correlate pretty strongly. Like, so these identical twins who were separated at birth, they would have sort of identical levels of religiosity, like they tracked pretty closely, but whichever religion they adopted was just a product of their, immediate cultural and familial surroundings. So there were two twins, like one of them grew up in Poland, the other one grew up in Trinidad. The one who grew up in Trinidad was like a very devout Jew, and the one who grew up in Poland was a very devout Catholic. So like they matched each other in religiosity, but they had completely different beliefs. So yeah, maybe there is some genetic basis for religiosity, which is, a very broad term, but still it's interesting.
Yeah, that seems pretty plausible that the general religiosity might be more genetic, while what specific religion you pick out is cultural. So I should mention that even if that's the case, that still the struggle for saying that religion is adaptive is then so because religion and these religiosity influenced sort of predispositions are going to be a very modern acquisition. You need long time frames for evolution to really work and weed out what's adaptive and non-adaptive in terms of these predispositions. And so the question will be, has religion been around long enough in order for it to sort of stand out as something clearly adaptive? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is.
I think the case that people make in favor of the adaptation side of things is that like religion burns up a lot of energy, and like, it's kind of costly, so since evolution is so ruthlessly efficient, like if it wasn't really doing anything, then it would have been dispensed with like a long time ago.
Well, religion might be, we have to distinguish between like cultural practices that are adapted to engage in, and then the actual predisposition towards religion itself and being religious as being adaptive, right? Like, I'm trying to think of a good example that could spell that out. But certainly, I think engaging in group behavior is adaptive, for sure. But are specific markers of your group identity, particularly like religion, as opposed to some other group marker, is that particularly adaptive, and is predisposition towards that particularly adaptive? I'm not sure. whether it is.
Um, can we try to like draw this together before we move into the next section about these theories kind of being antecedently more probable on naturalism and theism, like
Yeah.
these kind of threads, like can you draw them together into kind of a story about how evolution formed, through the lens of like the prolific agency, cognition, and signaling theories?
Yeah. So basically, the idea would be that uh, over our evolutionary past, we've had a variety of forces shape the way our cognition works. And we're particularly prone towards, first of all, detecting and picking up on signals from the environment and then translating those signals into stories. And it seems like religious stories that involve certain kinds of agents are particularly sort of rife with cognitive appeal to us. And then presumably they got passed down, sort of formalized into explicit tradition, and then maintained via signaling processes. That is to say that it was really beneficial to have groups form around these ideas and then sort of have group membership based in adhering to these ideas. And so it seems like the combination of these two ideas, we have something of a story of why religious belief would have sort of first forms, like why the ideas for it would have first formed, and then why those ideas would have gone passed down and maintained throughout generations. Now, that's obviously an incomplete story. There are other pieces to that evolutionary puzzle, and there's also historical factors we haven't talked about. But it at least seems like there's some pretty good evidence that the reason that we're religious is, or that many people are religious, is because evolution has sort of predisposed us to easily pick up on these religious ideas and to translate them and to adhere to them. And that's a story, by the way, where you don't need to invoke supernatural agents at all to explain why we would be religious. It's a totally naturalistic story. And so the sort of next question is, can that tell us anything about theism and naturalism, or is that totally neutral with regards to the truth or falsity of religion?
Yeah. So, like religion is a complex set of behaviors and beliefs. And, like you said, this isn't like a total explanation of religion, but it does explain key components of religion. So, given these, very unobjectionable, not very controversial features of human psychology, you can generate a religious tradition. And as you pointed out in your paper, what we do know about the history of religion does kind of track with the history that you would expect if it was generated by these cognitive and social structures. Um, yeah, so that alone doesn't really seem evidentially neutral to me, but some theists do try to co-opt these sorts of theories where they say, yeah, I bet God did imbue us with all these things and set these factors in motion so that religion would evolve. Um, so I can think of a couple problems with that off the bat, but I'll just hand it over to you so you can try to explain like why are these theories evidence for naturalism? Like why are they more probable on naturalistic theories as contrasted with theistic theories?
Right. So the first thing I want to start with is just the general fact that religion has come about partially by these natural mechanisms. That is to say that religious belief has been formed via this naturalistic process. That general fact alone seems much more probable on naturalism than theism to me, because on naturalism, assuming that we have a view of naturalism where we're sort of saying, hey, fundamental stuff is physical, and any other order of reality that comes about is dependent ultimately on these like sort of physical natural processes. If that's the theory we're working with, then the only way that religion could come about is via these natural physical means, right? It has to come about by some natural evolutionary process, because there is no other way that it could come about, since everything is ultimately dependent on these fundamentally physical processes. While if theism is true, sure, God could use natural processes if he wanted, but he didn't have to. He could just directly implant religious beliefs in people, like we were talking about earlier. Or he could use, for instance, like the special creation process described in the book of Genesis, some totally supernatural process to bring about religious belief. So it seems like the probability that we get something like the cognitive science account is basically one if naturalism is true, but it's less than one if theism is true. So just without even getting into the specifics, it seems like it's some evidence for naturalism. And then I'll let you comment on that before we move on.
Yeah,
Say something.
I just wanted to ask you at this point because I was just on Twitter actually right before we got on, and I saw Cameron Bertuzzi and you interacting about how, so Cameron sometimes says that like naturalism doesn't seem to predict very much. You have to add these things. So if you're adding evolution, then already, he's objecting. Like this isn't just naturalism anymore. This is naturalism plus evolution. And then you're adding all this other stuff, signaling theory and, prolific agency and all that. So are you lowering the prior probability of naturalism in like a problematic way. You know, like, are you kind of, you know, shooting yourself in the foot by lowering the prior probability of naturalism by invoking all these theories that we've been talking about?
Right. So 2 points about that. First of all, purely without even adding those things in, it seems like purely from the content of each hypothesis, we have a reason to expect this on naturalism that we don't on theism, which is that, and actually on naturalism, that it's required that religion will come about this way. Because on naturalism, just purely is the claim that fundamental reality is physical and any other order of reality that exists depends on that physical reality. The only way you're going to get anything like religion is going to be via some physical process, ultimately physical process. But I think the more important point in response to that is to say that those sort of facts you mentioned about evolution, what else do you say? Evolution, what are the other facts you talked about?
Oh, just what we've been talking about, signaling theory, the hyperactive agency detection. Like you're
Oh, right.
invoking other things in your explanation of religious origins.
Right. So the question we're going to want to ask is how likely are these explanations for religious belief on naturalism? So they won't be something that are in the background when we're evaluating this probability. These are like the things to be explained. But evolution might be in the background, but that's not lowering the prior probability of naturalism because evolution is in the background for theism too, right? Like all these sort of natural processes are in the background on both hypotheses. And if they're in the background on both hypotheses, they're not uniquely lowering the prior probability of naturalism. It's not as if we're saying naturalism plus evolution explains the data, and then you have theism plus something else that isn't evolution. Presumably both theists and naturalists believe in evolution and are going to use it to try and predict the data. And now, even if we pack, I'm trying to think if you could pack, you might not be able to pack evolution in the background when making this judgment because that's sort of directly part of the data in question that we're sort of asking in general. The fact that religion comes about by these evolutionary processes, how likely is that on theism versus naturalism? You might be able to include in the background that other sort of things have come about by evolution and then make the inductive judgment that therefore probably religious belief would too. But of course, if naturalism is true, then that's the only way that religious belief could come about. If theism is true, God could use evolution as he has for other things to bring about religious belief, but he didn't have to, right? He could, again, use the special creation process or all these other ways that he has to institute religious belief. So I don't think that that naturalists are somehow like secretly using evolution in a way that theists can't. Both theists and naturalists can help themselves to evolution. I don't think it changes things.
Yeah, I'm always confused by that response because it's like, hang on, do you want to exclude evolution from your model? Like, I mean, first of all, you can't make that move that we've kind of been talking about, like, oh, theists want to co-opt this stuff. Actually, you know, one key component was kind of developed and popularized by a theist. Like, if theists want to help themselves to the kinds of explanations that you're talking about and saying, oh, that's just how God chose to do it, well, then we have exactly the same things in our theory, except they're adding this, you know, supernatural realm and like, oh, by the way, God started this process. As opposed to the, you know, naturalistic route, which doesn't involve all that extra baggage. But yeah, it's like evolution is going to be a part of your model as well. Do you not want to include evolution? So yeah, it doesn't uniquely lower the prior probability of naturalism relative to theism. It, I mean, technically speaking, it does lower the prior probability because it's a more, you know, complicated hypothesis. Like naturalism plus evolution is more than just naturalism, but still, it doesn't uniquely lower the prior probability of naturalism. So I don't see why it's a problem unless you're a young Earth creationist and you don't want there to, and you just don't want to include evolution, you know. But then you've got other problems if you want to be a young Earth creationist.
Right, exactly. And to the question that Cameron likes to ask me about this, or just say in general, is he'll say, you know, usually he's talking about suffering, but to apply it to this discussion, he'll say, you know, okay, maybe does theism predict this? I'm not sure, but how does naturalism predict it? And to be very explicit about the answer in this case, at least with regards to general fact that religious belief has come about by these like physical natural mechanisms, the answer is because on naturalism, that's the only way it could come about. So the probability is one, it had to come about via these natural mechanisms. On theism, God could use natural mechanisms if he wanted to, but he didn't have to. He had a bunch of other options that just aren't present on naturalism, which just makes the probability lower on theism. That in general, you get this natural start to religious belief.
Yeah, because remember the data in question here is that religion came about through these natural mechanisms. Like that's kind of what we're talking about. There are these plausible evolutionary mechanisms that explain, you know, religious belief. Like, isn't that the data that we're trying to explain that we're saying is evidence for naturalism over theism?
Right, right, and that's without getting into the specifics, which we can shortly, because I think that's actually the more important part of the case.
Yeah, so we've been kind of we only just started talking about this, which is kind of more important. Like we mentioned at the outset, I think that a mistake a lot of people make, a mistake that I made back when I was first reading about this stuff, where I was more active in like psychology of religion, like 5 or 6 years ago, before it was kind of displaced by philosophy. But the psychology and cognitive science of religion stuff isn't enough on its own to constitute an argument against theism. Like, okay, you've got this stuff that you're working with now, you have to make the argument explicit after that point, and a lot of people make the mistake of not doing that. So for instance, like genetically modified skeptic is pretty interested in this psychology of religion stuff, but he's kind of, I don't want to say anti-philosophy, but he has, you know, kind of an attitude about philosophy that seems pretty common in the atheist community, which I would say is not warm and receptive towards it. But the problem is that you're not going to make very good arguments, you know, if you don't know anything about philosophy or you refuse to engage with it at all. So yeah, all right. So we've got this evolutionary account of religion, but it's more probable on like naturalism assigns a higher probability to this than theism does, because as you're saying, on theism, God has all these options. You know, like he could specially create us. He could choose to create us through evolution, but he didn't have to. And in fact, as far as I know, most Christians don't think he did. You know, so the thing that actually happened is not only less likely on theism, but many theists have still not come around to the view that this is actually how it happened.
Right, and you might even want to bolster sort of the argument I was making earlier by saying, hey, I think there's a good reason most theists think that we didn't come about, or that religious belief, or just in general, humans wouldn't come about by evolution, which is that, I don't know, the special creation process just seems more like what a perfect being would use to bring about us. I mean, it definitely results in a lot less suffering. It seems to be a lot more sort of profound and glorious in a lot of ways, and sort of just this slow, gradual, natural process. So at least I have the intuition that if a God existed, they would prefer to use a special creation process than use evolution, and I suspect that's why a lot of theists don't want to accept evolution. That plus the fact that, of course, it contradicts a very literalist, fundamentalist interpretation of Genesis.
Right. Yeah. I mean, evolution is a brutal process filled with extinction and death and waste and pain and suffering and fear. And yeah, it's not obvious that a perfect being or a loving being would choose to bring about creation through this brutal process where like 99.8 or 0.9% of species die, something like that. You know, like it's just a process filled with death and extinction and pain and brutality. And it's, yeah, I mean, obviously special creation would be better in a moral sense, like in practically every evaluative sense, it would be better if, yeah, we were brought about that way instead of the way that we were brought about. And yeah, there's also just this, like, you know, as a matter of probability, it's like, this is the only way it could happen on naturalism, and God has options. So there are multiple things going for this. And like one thing I would add is that, you know, there are these general features of religion with like the specific doctrines that differ. And, you know, this is salient especially salient, I would say, like evidentially in theologically significant doctrines, since if naturalism is true, they're indistinguishable from the theologically unimportant doctrines. Um, you know, like they came about through the same process. Like it doesn't matter if it's like, oh, theologically very central, you know, or if it's just kind of on the periphery and it's more of a disagreement than like or just more of a difference than like a core disagreement between religious people. Um, you know, just this indifferent evolutionary process. Like you keep mentioning that it must be, or you know, the important feature of it is that it's physical, but it seems like the really important feature of it is that it's indifferent. So like if it comes about through this indifferent process, then um, there's not going to be any distinction between these theologically unimportant doctrines that evolved and these theologically important doctrines that evolved. They came about through the same process. So you would expect there to be, you know, sort of this geographic balkanization where even for theologically very crucial beliefs, you know, they're just different depending on where these different beliefs evolved. You know, whereas if theism is true, you might expect there to be differences, but not like core disagreements on like theologically really important doctrines like you know, soteriological issues. So like this is one of the main reasons that I have a hard time like accepting any form of theism, where it's like, you know, uh, God was apparently not being very careful about these soteriological issues, and you know, the differences between people, like the religious diversity here, like religious diversity, I mean, who cares with most of it? But then when it comes to these soteriological issues, like these salvation issues, and like a lot of Christians and Muslims believe that you're going to go to hell for all of eternity because you ended up with the wrong religious beliefs. Well, now this soteriological confusion and discord, which is totally expected on the naturalistic hypothesis because they're just being all like these theologically important and unimportant doctrines are all just being generated by the same indifferent process. Now contrast that with, oh, God's somehow involved and he wants you to, be saved. He wants to be in a relationship with you. Well, there's a distinction, if God exists, between theologically important doctrines and theologically unimportant doctrines. On the naturalistic hypothesis, there's no difference. On the theistic hypothesis, there's a massive difference between these theologically important and unimportant doctrines. And yet they're all discordant, they're all kind of confused, and there's all this diversity, like just as if there's no top-down organizational structure trying to, communicate a divine message. So for me, that's like one of the more important pieces of data here that really supports the naturalistic evolutionary model of religious origins as contrasted with, the theistic evolutionary model of religious origins.
Yeah, I agree. It seems right that we have positive reason to think on theism that if God exists, that they'd want to ensure that these sort of essential doctrines are not just randomly distributed geographically, and that everyone has some sort of equitable access to them that we don't seem to have on naturalism.
So let's talk about why the specific theories and models that we were talking about are more expected on naturalism as contrasted with theism. And I'm going to pull up your paper here. By the way, is there anywhere that people can read this?
So not right now. So I ultimately want to submit a version of this paper for publication somewhere, but just due to being really, really busy, I haven't had the chance to. But if people follow my blog or my YouTube channel or my Twitter, which you can link in the description, I will definitely let people know when it's available for being read publicly, which it will eventually be. But for now, no, there's not a place people can read it.
Okay, so I mean, this argument does take like a general abductive form. Can you run through, you've got Greg Dawes's refinement of abductive reasoning here. So can you run through this and then we'll move from there into the Bayesian stuff?
Yeah, so just generally speaking, for people who aren't familiar with abduction, just very broadly, it's just the idea that, hey, if you have two hypotheses, you want to pick the one that's going to better predict and explain the data that you see, which seems really, really straightforward and simple, right? So imagine that you're in your college dorm room and you have two hypotheses about where your roommate's been. One hypothesis is that they were just at a party. The other hypothesis is they were just at the library studying. And now suppose that they come back to your room and they're staggering around and they smell like alcohol. Well, that is more likely to have occurred. That they're more likely to come back that way if they were at a party than if they were at the library. And so that's some evidence that they were at the party versus being at the library. So this is a kind of reasoning we use all the time, but you can sort of formalize it. There are two ways to do it. One is just to use a general abductive schema, and that's what I have here. This is from a great book, Theism Explanation by Gregory Dawes. The schema is just this. The surprising fact E is observed. So for instance, the fact that your roommate came back staggering around. H would be a satisfactory explanation of E. So H could be like the hypothesis that they were at a party. No available competing hypothesis would explain E as well as H does. So again, the other hypothesis that they were at the library or any other one that you could think of would not be as good of an explanation that they came back staggering around. And then the fourth thing you need to sort of make it valid, it is reasonable to accept the best available explanation of any fact, provided that explanation is a satisfactory one. And so that's just a general abductive schema you can use, and therefore you conclude it's reasonable to accept H. Now you can sort of further formalize that using Bayes' theorem. If we scroll down in the paper, I think I sort of show the general form of that. So Bayes' theorem is just sort of a way you can mathematically state sort of the general reasoning I just used, and you can actually make it deductively follow that a piece of evidence is more like, a piece of evidence confirms a hypothesis. Basically, you need sort of what's called a prior probability of a hypothesis, and then the probability of a piece of data on a hypothesis, and you sort of combine those together, do some math, and you end up being able to conclude exactly how much evidential support a piece of data provides for a hypothesis. The details don't matter super a lot because gets into like a whole, again, rabbit hole of like controversy around Bayesian epistemology. I just like to like think of it as a nice way to sort of model what's going on in abductive inference. But in general, that's the sort of form that my argument takes on. I don't have like a huge preference necessarily for needing to use Bayes' theorem or just talking generally abductively when discussing it.
Okay, so that is the general form that your argument takes, where like the surprising facts that we're talking about, that's how you're justifying this. So yeah, can you expand a little bit more about why these surprising facts are, just more expected on naturalism than on theism?
Yeah, so we should start with a sort of assumption that I use in my arguments. It's not a necessary assumption for all of my arguments, but it is for some of them. And that's that in addition to the general theistic claim that God is all good, all knowing, and all powerful, I sort of add the idea that God desires that people have correct beliefs about them. And it'll become clear why that assumption is necessary for my argument. In my paper, I sort of argue that, hey, you sort of, as a theist, you sort of are in an uncomfortable position with regards to this. This idea that God desires that you have correct beliefs about him. You can either accept it, and then that creates the sort of issues that my argument brings up, or you can deny it, and then you get into a bunch of like theological problems if you're a sectarian theist. That's probably not worth going super into here, because I think most sectarian theists will suppose that that's the case, that God would want you to have correct beliefs about him. I mean, that's sort of what religious belief is based on in most traditions, right? Is that it's good to affirm that God exists, or if not affirm that God exists, at least participate in religious communities somehow and participate in the religious life, which is all my argument really needs.
I mean, regardless, it seems like pretty much all theists agree that like it matters what you believe in some sense. Maybe you don't go to hell for believing the wrong thing. Oh, you accepted the wrong propositions or failed to accept the right propositions, so now you're going to burn. Okay, that's not universal among theists, but it's very hard to find theists who think that like what you believe just doesn't matter and like God is totally disinterested in it.
Exactly, and that's all you need. You don't need anything stronger like, oh yeah, you go to hell if you don't believe the right thing for my argument. Just that correct belief is some sort of importance to God. Okay, so now given that assumption, so let's start with the prolific agency cognition account. Two important facts about that. The first is that the prolific agency cognition, it sets you up to believe in all sorts of different supernatural agents, not just the God of theism. It sets you up to believe in witches, in ancestor spirits, in ghosts, in lesser gods, in greater gods, in the God of theism, the Trinitarian God, the Unitarian God. It sets you up to believe in all sorts of religious concepts and predisposes you in that way. That's the first fact. The second fact is that it seems like the degree to which we're likely to reason about agents and sort of be prolific agency detectors differs across people. It's not a universal feature, but sort of equal in everyone. I sort of told the story at the beginning of this about how I seem to sort of lack that to some degree. And it turns out that systematically, there are certain people who are neurodivergent who have a much greater sense for detecting agency and a much worse sense for detecting agency. So people who are on the autistic spectrum tend to be much less likely to detect agency and much less likely to sort of have their had be active, and thus seem to be less religious on average. On the other hand, people who are sort of on the schizotypal spectrum are in the opposite direction. They're much more likely to engage in agency detection. That, in fact, seems to sort of underlie things like hallucinations and a lot of like the delusions that people with schizotypy will harbor. And in turn, they also appear to be more religious. There are studies showing that they're more likely to be spiritual in some way. Again, it seems like there might be a causal link there. So why do I think those two facts are more probable on naturalism than theism? Well, the first reason is that it seems like theism generates positive reasons to not expect that naturalism doesn't have. So specifically, if God desires that you have correct beliefs about them, then it seems weird that you would predispose everyone to just sort of have a general belief in supernatural agency and not in God, the God of theism in particular, right? If you set up people to just have this very generalized agency detection device, that means they're going to end up believing in witches and ancestor spirits and all this false stuff that doesn't get you to the proposition that God actually wants you to accept. And to be very clear, because a common response to this is going to be to say, well, wouldn't it sort of take away people's free will to just have God predispose you and set you up to believe in him in particular? And the answer is no, because just because you're predisposed to believe in something and you have the option to believe in it doesn't mean that you actually will, right? Lots of people have this predisposition towards agency detection, have this concept available to them, and still don't believe in God. So I'm not asking that God just set everyone up with a belief in him. I'm just saying that if he's going to bring people about by this evolutionary process, you'd expect him to sort of set up our agency cognition so it's inclined towards theism, capital T theism in particular, rather than polytheism or tribal
Right.
religions, et cetera, et cetera. And secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, it seems like it's sort of a ethical principle that everyone accepts now, that you ought to give people an equal opportunity towards goods in the absence of sort of arbitrary and morally irrelevant differences between those persons, especially for things like neurodivergence. So, since correct belief in God is taken to be such a good thing, it seems to me, the perfectly loving being who would want people to have access to that correct belief so they can have a relationship with God, so they can participate in this good thing, that God would not arbitrarily predispose certain people based on their neurodivergent properties against belief in him, which is what it seems like has happened here. It'd be considered extremely unethical if a college or university were to say, hey, we're going to limit the amount of people with autism who can apply to this university on the basis that they're autistic, right? So equally, it seems really immoral and bizarre for God to say something like, hey, I'm going to limit the ability of autistic people to believe in me and to participate in religious tradition purely on the basis that they're autistic, which is essentially what this research seems to imply. So it seems like we have some positive reasons to really strongly not expect that this hyperactive agency stuff is inclined in the way it is on theism that does not exist on naturalism. And in addition, that's sort of enough to generate the disexpectation. But you could also point out that on naturalism, you can make a sort of inductive inference from the background knowledge that is undercut by these things I just talked about on theism towards this data, which is that just in general, human traits have inherent variability, right? We expect that traits will sort of be distributed on a standard curve, where some people will be highly likely to have that trait, or some people will have that trait sort of on one extreme, and some people will have that trait on another extreme, and then people sort of diverge towards the middle. So the fact that agency detection would be sort of distributed across the population unequally seems not pretty expected on naturalism. But of course, that inference from the background knowledge is undercut on theism precisely because of this consideration of the ethics of predisposing certain people against belief in God. So I could go into it more, but I think that gives the basic sketches of the argument with regards to prolific agency cognition.
Right. I mean, making people kind of neurodivergent and thereby depriving them of a relationship with God, which is, one of the greatest goods imaginable, a relationship with a being of perfect love and goodness. And that's not even bringing in the soteriological issues. But, what I thought you were going to say, the pushback with, we have this generalized like cognitive and social structure that generates belief in like witches and ancestor spirits. You said that it interferes with our free will, or that's like one common response. But I mean, that is quite literally what someone like Plantinga advocates. Like, we have a sensus divinitatis where we naturally come to believe in God, and then it gets damaged only like through sin. So we are kind of predisposed to believe in God according to many theists in other contexts. But what I thought you were going to say with the witches and ancestor spirits thing, I thought you were going to say, well, sometimes religious people want to say, well, yeah, that stuff is real. Like, there are witches, like, clearly that's a biblical idea, and ancestor spirits, I mean, how is that different from Catholics like praying to saints and stuff? I mean, it doesn't really seem, it seems like a Martian anthropologist would not make a huge distinction between Catholics praying to dead saints and, because they are technically our ancestors, and what you typically think of when you say ancestor worship or something like that. I mean, they're obviously not worshiping the saints, but they're still praying to them, which to my Protestant brain just still seems so like bizarre to me. Like, if Catholics can be Christians, then Mormons can be Christians. People, like, come on. But anyway, like you were saying, there's this neurodivergent people seem to be precluded from having a relationship with God, at least like statistically. And then on the other end, you have schizophrenic people. So I think what you're saying is, I'm schizophrenic and you're autistic. I think I'm following you perfectly there. Yeah, but so I guess I'm curious what you have to say about the witches and ancestor spirits thing, being like, well, no, actually that stuff is real too. It's, it's partially biblical, and it's definitely a part of Christian traditions.
Yeah, no, interesting. I didn't think about that response. That's sort of the first time I thought about that. That's an interesting point. Someone might say, hey, all this stuff is real, and so they are forming correct beliefs about that as well. I think I'd still say, well, hey, doesn't God want you? It doesn't seem like you gain a really great benefit from believing in witches or ancestor spirits. Maybe you do, but it seems like the benefit you gain from believing in God is greater. And so to have a device that's more honed on the important propositional thing would be good. And additionally, I think any person who's like a exclusive sectarian Christian or exclusive sectarian theist is going to need to admit that there are certain times where we form these beliefs about supernatural agents and we're mistaken about them, and it's not a thing that exists. I mean, it'd be bizarre to think that every single time that someone thinks there's an agent there, that there really is an agent there and it's a witch or a spirit. I guess that could be a belief that someone has or an account someone has, but I don't know, it seems to be incompatible with the teaching that, hey, other people's religious ideas are false in some way. You know, other people believe in the wrong supernatural agents. Maybe you could say you are correctly detecting an agent, you just don't know its nature properly, or you're detecting the wrong kind of agent. Or you think you're believing in this agent, but in reality, you're actually detecting this agent over here. But even if that's the case, there's still a problem, right? Because again, why didn't God tune these evolutionary mechanisms so that we wouldn't make that kind of mistake so easily?
Yeah,
And like
somehow I think Christians are not going to be very receptive to the idea that like we're all worshiping the same God, we're all like detecting the same God. We just call them different names because of our
right.
divergent cultures and stuff. Somehow I feel like that's not really going to fly with a lot of Christians. But yeah, that's the place they would have to go, I guess, if they were trying to respond to this.
Right, and actually, we haven't gone into this in this discussion, and so when my paper comes out, people can read more about it. But I think that the way Christians would want to go to respond to this argument is to adopt one of the most like very liberal universalist kinds of Christianity possible, like a Christianity that most hardcore sectarian conservative Christians really aren't going to like endorsing. And so if I push them in that direction via my argument, I think I'd be pretty happy with that, even if they don't end up becoming naturalists.
I would count that as a win too, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even think to ask that. You know, how different forms of Christianity kind of interact with this argument, because they don't all have the same resources. You know, like I love pointing out that universalist Christianity is basically the only viable form of Christianity in light of certain objections. You know, like I had this debate with John Buck, if people want to hear more about that, but how do you think that applies to this specific argument? You know, like how exactly would universalist Christianity be better off with regards to your specific argument, or would it just be universalists or other kinds of Christians as well?
I'm not sure. I use the term universalist. I was more thinking of a Christian who sort of. I don't know if I think there are Christians like this. Some people might not want to say they're Christians, but if you were a Christian who really fully rejected the idea that correct belief was super important to God at all, then you would sort of get out of the arguments that I'm making, because then if correct belief isn't important to God at all, then there's no reason for him to incline people equitably towards it. And so if you could sort of find a really, really liberal version of Christianity where, hey, whether or not you correctly affirm this proposition or participate in the religious life just isn't that important, then you might be able to get out of my arguments. Again, I'm not sure if they're going to be, some Christians are probably going to want to say that wouldn't be any form of Christianity I'd ever accept, but I do know some people who might adopt that. So
yeah, I mean, the things there get kind of muddy, because I can imagine someone like Eleanor Stump or C.S. Lewis kind of endorsing that. And yeah, that's not universalism. That's just, I don't know what the word is for that. I asked people recently, like, what is the word for this view I'm outlining? But, recently I was talking about what I consider to be the most plausible form of Christianity. And like, yeah, the two moving parts are universal salvation and the thing that you're talking about now, where it's like, God doesn't really, it's not that true belief is unimportant. It's just, man, I don't even know how to summarize it quickly. It's like, there are people who are serving God who don't know that that's what they're doing, and there are people who are not serving God who think that that's what they're doing. Because kind of having a relationship with God is not just a matter of having accurate beliefs, and like failing to accept the wrong propositions and succeeding and accepting the right propositions. Like that's not really what it's about. So like I think this has like a scriptural basis too, in like Matthew 25 with the sheep and the goats, where there are these people who Jesus says he never knew, who like clearly thought that they were like followers of his. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of fringe among most Christians. Like the idea that like atheists can go to heaven, Muslims can go to heaven, Christians can go to heaven. And there are many people who call themselves Christians who are not actually Christians. They like that last part, but they don't like the first part. But yeah, I guess that would help quite a bit, but it's not exactly, I don't know. Does that make sense what I'm outlining here?
Yeah, I think you'd have to take that and add to it that participating in the religious life may be good or important for any individual, but it's not something that God particularly desires that you do. as
Well,
opposed
that's
to
the wrinkle though, is like participating in the religious life, like that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like that's more important than having the correct attitude of like, oh, God doesn't like to be called Allah. He likes to be called God or something. Or like,
right.
yeah, like that's less important than actually living a religious life. But the point is like living a religious life is something that atheists can do, that like any theist can do. It's not a matter of like adopting the right propositional attitudes exactly.
Right. No, and I think what I meant to say there was you'd have to you'd want to construe religious life broadly enough so that it didn't involve like participation in a particular sectarian tradition or the
Yeah.
affirmation of a particular proposition.
Hmm.
Like you said, if you could construe religious life as just like participating in the good in some way without ever involving yourself in a particular tradition, like maybe atheists just by doing good or doing charity or living good lives of a good moral character, if that's just equally participating in the religious life as someone who's a Christian, and that could be, and that's equally important to God, then maybe then maybe we can sort of say that it's not super important to God that you particularly affirm any set of doctrines or sort of fit into the sectarian, some one particular sect or one particular broad tradition. I think that gets some way. It doesn't totally respond to my argument for reasons we'll see soon, but it gets some ways there.
Right. So, I mean, I've heard like Josh Rasmussen say that he thinks that God allows people to understand the divine, like interact with the divine through their own cultural windows, and he doesn't really see a problem with that. But yeah, let's move on to what you were just hinting at about why it doesn't completely, undermine the argument.
Yeah, so that'll bring us into costly signaling. So important fact about costly signaling. So as we said, costly signaling, specifically in the context of religion, is sort of the use of religion as a means to get people to show a genuine sign of commitment via these really costly rituals or displays of belief, displays of loyalty to the group. And we see these sorts of things across many, many different religions. But an important point about costly signaling is that it helps maintain in-group cohesion, and it helps maintain in-group trust. But precisely by the same mechanism of costly signaling, it promotes out-group hatred. It promotes bias. It promotes discrimination. It promotes tribalism and misogyny and racism and sexism and all these things we hate, because it forms these really, really tight group coalitions and commitment to these group coalitions at the expense of other groups. And so what we know is that these signaling mechanisms are really, really prone to creating like xenophobia and all these sort of horrible things that we think are sort of ethically wrong. And so then the question is, well, is this more likely on theism or naturalism? Because we know costly signaling, we're sort of taking it as an assumption here that costly signaling is one of the mechanisms that God is using to bring about and promote religious belief. Well, there's a number of reasons why it seems unlikely that God would use this on theism but not on naturalism. The first one sort of still relies on the idea that God desires that people have correct beliefs about him. And that's that signaling behavior ensures that people will get entrenched within their groups and make it harder to switch groups and go to other groups, right? Signaling behavior really promotes in-group cohesion, and so it makes it harder to leave and join other groups because you dislike them and because you're really attached to your group. But what that's going to mean is that it's going to be especially hard for people to convert out of their group and get into the correct group. So again, it impairs correct belief in God. The other reason, two reasons I would say why costly signaling seems unlikely on theism, is that precisely because it promotes all this horrible xenophobic behavior and attitudes. In general, it seems like God wouldn't want to use a mechanism that promotes all this immorality because God's perfectly good, but particularly when it comes to the institution of religious belief, because after all, religion is the institution that's meant to represent God. It's the institution that God is identified with in some way. And so for God to have his institution, as opposed to all the other just sort of contingent human institutions that he has less identification with, to be marred with all this horrible, horrible xenophobia and racism and hatred seems particularly surprising if God's perfectly good. So it's almost, you could frame it as just part of the problem of suffering if we just said, well, God doesn't want to promote immorality. But I think in particular, there's a problem here because when it comes to religious institutions, those are the institutions that we expect to most sort of be a beacon of God and to represent God's perfectly good nature. And yet we find that tied into the very mechanism by which these beliefs and institutions come about is this horribly immoral process. And so that's the reason I think that there's a disexpectation for signaling on theism, but not on naturalism.
Yeah. So, I mean, much like other things in evolution, God used this process that has all these like really terrible, I guess they're just side effects, of like the way that he chose to bring about religious belief. Yeah. And again, this was all totally avoidable. Like he didn't have to bring about religious belief through this particular set of mechanisms, which, have all these terrible byproducts. But there's one other thing I wanted to add about what we were talking about earlier. So maybe God wouldn't care about having the correct beliefs, quote unquote, with some issues, with some things that boil down to like mere differences between theists, but he would want you to have correct beliefs about the good, even on this like totally separate, or on the sort of like Eleanor Stump C.S. Lewis view, where there are some people who are pursuing God because they're pursuing the good, whether they think of that as what they're doing or not, and there are some people who are not pursuing God who think they are. Like, okay, well, even if you accept that view, which most Christians are not going to want to, but even if you accept that view, God still does want to ensure that we have correct beliefs about the good, even if he doesn't care if you, interpret the divine through your own cultural window or whatever. Still, he doesn't want you to believe that something that's evil is good or something like that. So yeah, he would care about correct beliefs, even if you accepted this like kind of liberal, somewhat fringe view that we've been outlining.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I wonder how liberal you'd have to make it to really fit with my argument. I'm not sure. That's sort of one thing I haven't fully explored yet.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover about why these sort of naturalistic mechanisms that produced religious belief and practice? So we've covered like several reasons that it's evidence for naturalism, that like all these features are more expected on naturalism than on theism. Like naturalism assigns a higher probability to these particular observations than theism. Is there anything else that you wanted to add that like clarifies that, or any additional stuff?
No, so I gave the sort of general sketch of the argument. As I said, people who want like a sort of refined, rigorous version of this, just wait for the paper. I'm just sort of talking off the cuff here, so it's not going to inevitably not going to spell out all the reasons and give the exact details in the way that reading the paper will. So when that comes out, just make sure to follow me, and you'll have sort of the exact rigorous formulation. But I think we covered the general sketches I wanted to cover the argument here.
Yeah, no, you can never cover all the details, just speaking on a podcast, kind of spontaneously, as opposed to having time to write and reflect and everything. So yeah, as soon as that's out, I'll make sure to link it in the description. I mean, do you have any kind of like timeline about when that'll be more publicly available, or?
No, unfortunately I don't.
Okay.
Probably at least a number of months.
Okay. Maybe you could do something about it on your own channel, though. You could add a second video to your repertoire.
I'm thinking of doing a video where I sort of do what we do and walk through like some of the cognitive science of religion stuff and the implications, just as like a presentation that's more formal and scripted. So people can definitely look out for that.
No, this has been like a very like 10,000 foot view of the paper. Like the paper goes into a lot of detail that we haven't even talked about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about hyperactive agency detection, signaling theory, and why those things are antecedently more likely on naturalism than on theism. Okay. So there are a few like potential objections that you address in the paper. And we're not going to like go through them in detail here. Maybe that's something you could do over on your channel. But yeah, I mean, we're already like well past an hour, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. And honestly, like these objections do seem like some of the better possible objections that that could be offered to the argument. And to be honest, I don't know if I really expect those kinds of objections to come up in the YouTube comments or on Twitter after this interview comes up. So do you want to just go through? I mean, you mentioned like 3 of them, right?
Yeah. So there are 2 broad approaches to objections I think people could take. One approach, and this is sort of analogous to what you can do in response to the problem of evil. So when you have some piece of data that looks more unlikely on your hypothesis than on competitors, there are 2 things you could do. One is you could offer expansions to your hypothesis that are meant to account for the data, right? You could offer sort of, it'd be what's known as a theodicy if we were talking about the problem of evil. You could add something to theism that is meant to predict the data. So you could say, look, here are some ways I can expand theism that make this stuff from the cognitive science of religion look more expected. The other broad approach you could take is the sort of skeptical theist approach, where you say, you are not in a position to make the kind of probability judgments that you are claiming to make, that somehow the probability judgment is undermined not by some extra facts that we know about theism, but by the fact that we're so epistemically far from God's will or his goals or whatever that you can't actually know what the probability of this data would be on theism relative to naturalism. So those are the 2 sort of broad approaches you could take, and I address both of them in the paper. So briefly, in terms of the expansions to theism that I talk about, the three I consider are, one would be to sort of take on a sort of a view of God that a philosopher called Daniel Howard Snyder takes in one of his papers in response to a philosopher called Paul Draper, who influenced my paper a lot and has an argument similar to mine about evolution. And
my listeners know who Paul Draper is. They're familiar.
Good. Well, that's good. I'm glad. So Daniel Howard Snyder sort of tries to adopt a concept of God who works sort of only through naturalistic mechanisms to do things. And that could be one way to expand theism. Another expansion would be to think about Christianity in particular. I don't think that's a particularly good one, but it's one that a lot of Christians particularly like to use. And then the third option would be to sort of offer what I call sort of an epistemic distance reply. And this would be to sort of say, hey, sure, correct belief is important to God, but there's other stuff that trumps correct belief that's even more important to God, and that prevents God from predisposing us towards correct belief in him. And there's a lot of reasons you might give in response to that, or reasons you might supply for why correct belief is trumped by other things. And so I won't go into, I have responses to all of these. Again, on my channel, I'll post a video going through them, and in the paper I talk about them. But those are sort of the three sort of quote unquote theodicies for this data that I discuss. And then I talk about skeptical theism. And I essentially what I end up arguing is that if you want to be such a skeptical theist, you can apply your skepticism to undermine the probability judgments that I make, in addition to ones about the problem of evil. You end up undercutting theism as an explanatory theory in general. If you're just so skeptical that you think that we can't evaluate the probability of certain pieces of data on naturalism relative to theism, not just with regards to suffering, but with regards to all different domains, and it seems like we can never evaluate how good theism is as a theory. It just sort of has no explanatory content because it can't predict or retrodict anything whatsoever. So that's sort of the reductio, or one of the reductios I end up using. I also think independently, even if that doesn't work, that skeptical theism has serious problems. But that's sort of so none of that's an outline of how the responses work, but that's sort of the conclusion I come to, is that none of them end up undermining the argument.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with skeptical theism is like, it depends, like, on the details, like, so some forms of skeptical theism are too skeptical and they basically just annihilate your ability to assign credences to anything. Yeah, I mean, some theists have tried to respond to that sort of objection. Do you think those work in general? Or, I mean, do you think there's any form of skeptical theism that is not excessively skeptical and ends up kind of diminishing our ability to assess evidence?
I think that you can come up with versions of skeptical theism like that won't totally undermine the judgments, but the problem is that you can't come up with ones that will then undermine the specific judgment that I make. Because like the more restricted forms of skeptical theism are limited, they block specific kind of inferences that you make with regards to problems of evil that just won't apply to any sort of inference that I make in my argument. So to get the skeptical theism to block my argument, you really need to make your skeptical theism super broad. And I just can't see a way of making it broad enough to undermine my argument, but in a way that doesn't end up collapsing like arguments in favor of theism, like fine-tuning or other arguments that you might cite that favor theism over naturalism. So I think that if you want to maintain theism's explanatory worth, you can't say, hey, when it comes to all the data that favors naturalism, we can't make that judgment. But when it comes to the data that favors theism, yeah, that works. We can make that judgment. We're not too skeptical for that. I think there's just no non-sort of biased way to do that. And again, the details of that require going into the specific principles and being very careful about it. So yeah, people should read the paper if they want to hear about that.
I also wanted to ask you about the argument that some very intelligent people have made. It's called the argument from widespread theistic belief, or a common consent argument. It has very intelligent defenders. I don't know if you've heard about it or not, but do you think that this argument that you're talking about works as like an undercutting or rebutting defeater for that kind of argument from widespread theistic belief, which does appeal to like the phenomenon of the persistence and prevalence of theistic belief? Actually, like when I was in my like devil's advocate debate, I also referenced Justin Barrett in the Cognition, Theology, and Religion projects, those three words in some order. And he was talking about how he thinks that belief in God, or gods, is pretty old, like it's not like a recent arrival in like human history. So, that's obviously what you would expect if theism were true. It'd be a very old, very commonly held belief among human beings. And if the inverse were true, if it was like a very rare belief that was held by almost no one and arrived very recently, then that would be surprising on theism. So, the opposite is evidence for theism. So do you think that your argument kind of works as a defeater for that sort of argument from widespread theistic belief?
So I'm actually inclined to agree with that very, very generally widespread theistic beliefs more likely on theism than naturalism. The problem is what I think my argument shows, and this is what you're probably getting at, is that that evidence is wildly understated, right?
Mhm.
You have to appeal to this really, really general fact. But hey, in general, we're sort of predisposed towards religion, and lots of people believe in God. But the second you get into the specifics of that belief, the fact that it's so varied, as you pointed out earlier, that the content, like the important soteriological content, varies across traditions, and specifically the fact that it's come about by these mechanisms that seem so unexpected, and the fact that it's so variable, sort of your predisposition towards it, based on totally arbitrary factors. Once you take into account all these specific facts, then the evidence starts to look a lot more in favor of naturalism than theism. And I think that's a general pattern with theistic arguments, is that they tend to sort of parasitize very general facts and ignore more specific facts. So I think I agree with Barrett and the people who make that argument that that is evidence for theism. The problem is just completely understated. The second you fully state the facts about the formation of religious belief, it doesn't look good for theism anymore. And in fact, the very same sort of reasoning that you probably have to use to argue that widespread theistic belief would be likely on theism is going to also show that the kind of sort of origins of religion that we see via prolific agency cognition and costly signaling should not be likely on theism. Because to argue that widespread theistic belief is likely on theism, you probably have to say, hey, God desires that people have correct belief in him. That's good, which is precisely what I need to make my arguments work. So I think that's what I think about that.
Right. No, that's a great point. But yeah, I mean, just in general, the understated evidence, yeah, that does seem to happen a lot, where it's just this very broad general fact. You can summarize it very quickly, and it's like, yeah, I guess that is evidence for theism. And then you start taking a closer look at it, and many things start popping up that are unexpected. Yeah, and I do get kind of frustrated with some of the hand wavy responses from theists, where it's like, well, still the general fact is, more expected on theism than on indifference. So, we can ignore all these like more specific facts. Anyway, I've kind of been pushed slightly off of the hypothesis of indifference anyway, basically because of the argument from psychophysical harmony and like a couple other more minor considerations. But I'm nowhere near, the level of non-indifference, I guess, that theists propose. But yeah, that there is that general pattern of understated evidence. But yeah, that's actually a really funny point, that like the stuff that they need in order to make that argument in the first place is exactly what you need to make your
Yeah,
argument.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I'm very happy to concede it.
Yeah, because they do try to. I mean, I can imagine some people trying to have it both ways there, where at one point in the argument they accept that, and then once we get to this point, then they're like, well, why would you assume something like that?
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. So, I understand that you have a general blog post / video coming up about atheism that's like kind of similar to my Why I'm an Atheist episode / blog post that I made, except the one that I wrote is less than 5,000 words, and the one that you're writing is already somewhere around 20,000 words.
Yeah. So I've been working on I've wanted to do a sort of Why I'm a Naturalist / Atheist post for a while, where I outline all the major reasons that I think sort of favor naturalism over theism, and just to sort of preview it, it sort of takes the same general explanatory format as this argument, but I'm not just looking at one thing. I'm looking at sort of all the data that people talk about and trying to sort of summarize what I see as the most important points in the debate and the most important objections, and sort of I try to weigh the evidence for naturalism against the evidence for theism and argue that, hey, like there's problems with the evidence that theists cite that there aren't with the pieces of evidence that naturalists cite. And then I look at the prior probabilities of both theories and sort of try and conclude with some personal notes about the causes, the things that have brought me to being an atheist that aren't related to evidence, since I think that's something people often neglect to mention. So yeah, people can look out for that. That'll be sort of a really long blog post. I'll hopefully have a video accompanying it. Sort of be like I imagine it'll be sort of a length of like Joe Schmid's Why I'm an Agnostic thing, just really comprehensive and long. So yeah, that'll be coming hopefully in the next month.
So you're kind of examining the cumulative case for atheism or naturalism, and then comparing it to the cumulative case for theism, and that's why the length is what it is, because you're actually like getting into the details of the cumulative case on both sides.
Exactly. Like I try and look at every piece of major evidence that I think would favor both theism and naturalism. Obviously, I can't look at everything people would think is relevant, but I try and pick the ones that I think are the most important, and so that takes a while to cover both sides. So that's why it's sort of taking so long to produce.
Yeah, no, true. I mean, I barely did that in my "Why I'm an Atheist" post. Like, I just sort of listed the evidence, and I'm like, look, these are things that I think are more expected on naturalism than on theism, but I'm not even going to try to explain why, really. Um, which is why it made me laugh so hard when I saw some comment that was like, "This is overkill. Like, what are you doing?" I'm like, I haven't even started, but it sounds like you're actually going to go through, doing the hard work of actually explaining why, all these lines of evidence, this cumulative case for atheism, like, why is it the case that this is more expected on atheism? Like, why is it actually evidence for atheism rather than just kind of asserting it and moving on like I did? Because honestly, I mean, some of it I do think is kind of obvious. Like, it kind of strains my credulity when some people say like, oh, this or that is not actually evidence for naturalism. Like, occasionally you even hear stuff like evil is evidence for theism. And like I said, that stuff is just so obviously wrong to me that it's tough to like engage with it because it doesn't. I don't want to, just go off and accuse someone of like bad faith or anything, but it's so obviously wrong. But anyway, you actually do go through like the work of, making the cumulative case.
Right.
So is evil evidence for theism? Quick question.
Is evil evidence for theism?
For theism, yeah.
That's something that Cameron has said, isn't it?
That's something a few people have said, and yeah, Cameron is one of them.
I just can't understand why Cameron keeps. Yeah, I also, this is not relevant to the discussion, but Cameron keeps. It is relevant to the other video I made. He keeps reposting his whole argument about why naturalism and evolution don't predict suffering, but theism does. Even though, as far as I can tell, he has not responded to the argument, my counter argument in that video, or anyone's counter argument. He just sort of keeps repeating the same claim. And so I'm curious as to whether he's actually going to end up like posting something responding to all of us, or he's just going to keep repeating the same thing. He just refuses to accept that naturalism or naturalism plus evolution predict anything, but he won't sort of respond to the reasons people give for why it does, which is kind of annoying.
Yeah, no, I think you should do that. Because I clicked on the link, like I said earlier, I saw you guys arguing on Twitter, and I clicked on the link he posted, and I saw it was from 2017. And I was like, you've been saying this for 5 years, first of all, but like
Literally,
also,
yeah.
but yeah, it's like, hasn't anyone said anything, that you think is worthy of like clarifying or like responding to in any way since 2017? But yeah, I thought that well, I mean, wasn't there a blog post in response to the video you made that was written by someone else?
Yeah, but that blog post, as the sort of author of that blog admitted, wasn't really defending Cameron's argument. He was providing his own arguments, which made me kind of confused because the blog post was sort of sent to me as if it was meant to be a refutation of what I said in response to Cameron, when in reality it was this third person, their name's Seth Hart. It was their own sort of contribution to the debate, independent of Cameron's argument. So even if they're completely right, everything they said, it doesn't really bolster Cameron's case at all. But I also responded to that blog post as well on my blog, which people can go check out my response to. So,
okay, and where is your blog again?
Naturalismnext.blogspot.com. You can link it in the description.
It will be linked in the description, as will Naturalism Next, the YouTube channel. And yeah, I mean, is there any other place people can find you? Do you want people to find you on Twitter or Discord or anywhere else you're active?
Yeah, people can follow me on Twitter. I'm most active on Discord. Maybe I'll send you like a link to one of the servers that I'm in. People can join if they want to talk to me. That's honestly where most of the discussion I engage in goes on. So people can just follow that social media, and I'll sort of link updates to what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And there's a link tree in the description, and one of the links there goes to my Discord, which I believe is how we met. I actually can't remember how we met, but I know that like you.
There, yeah.
Okay, it was on Discord, and you and Bread Santa. I don't know if he wants me to use his real name or not, but you and Bread were you always like came as like a package deal, at least in my mind. And you guys.
Yeah, I should mention that I co-run Naturalism Next with yeah, I don't know if he wants me to use his real name, but a friend of mine, Bread Santa, also a very smart guy. Mm-hmm. So people should follow him as well.
Yeah, he's the other co-host of Naturalism Next. Yeah, like I said at the beginning, you're the co-host of that YouTube channel that is the only atheist channel that produces less content than Real Atheology, and then Bread Santa is the other half of Naturalism Next. But yeah, so we've got the YouTube channel, the blog. We'll put the link to the Discord you're talking about in the description. And yeah, I mean, thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed it. I haven't gotten to talk about psychology of religion in like literally like years. I think it was like the last time I talked about it because it was kind of displaced by by interest in philosophy, I guess. But yeah, I mean, psychology was kind of like the first scientific love of mine, I guess. Like the first kind of exposure I had to science was like through my mom, because she was a counseling psychologist, and like had her own practice for a while, and I would like read the DSM, and just like flip through it. And then she would like, you know, it would disappear. I'd be like, "Where'd it go?" And she's like, "I need it for work. You can't just have it in your room for weeks on end." But yeah, I mean, thanks for coming on and talking about psychology of religion and cognitive science of religion. It was really good.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for having me. It's been good to flex these muscles because I haven't actually thought about the psychology of religion stuff in a little while. I've sort of gotten distracted by other philosophy, so it's good to return back to it. So yeah, thanks again for having me on.